Hello upgraders and welcome to another episode of the Upgraded Ape Show. On today's show we have Aubrey de Grey, who is an expert and a research scientist in the world of aging. And it sounds crazy when you put it in perspective, but at the moment there's a 100% chance of death. And I don't want to sound too morbid, but this includes you, your friends and your family. Aubrey gives us a fascinating insight into his work today, and we talk about what the main causes of aging are, how they relate to neurodegenerative diseases, mitochondrial issues over time, and how potentially aging is just a breakdown of the body and brain system, and it can either be reverted or stopped. Aubrey himself is an author. He founded the SENS Research Foundation, has a BA in Computer Science and a PhD in Biology from the University of Cambridge. And it was great to speak to, I think, the first Brit that I've had on the show so far. He's a fellow of the American Aging Association, sits on editorial and scientific advisory boards, and much more. Aubrey will be coming back on the show shortly to discuss cancer, but today's show we focus on aging, and without further ado, let's jump straight in.
Welcome to the Upgraded Ape Show, your daily dose of brain upgrades to help you kick life's ass. And here's your host, Will Barron.
Hi Aubrey, and welcome to the Upgraded Ape Show.
Thank you for having me on the show.
No worries at all. I'm really excited to dive into the world of anti-aging and all the work that you do. But can you just give the listeners a little bit of an overview of what it is you actually do and also how you got there?
Sure. So I am the Chief Science Officer of a charity based in California called SENS Research Foundation. And we are a biomedical research charity, which means that we spend the money that we can get on developing new therapies, new medicines that don't yet exist, that will be much more effective than medicines that do exist. The medicines that we're interested in are specifically to tackle the diseases and disabilities of old age, and the general way that we're going about it that distinguishes us from most people who work in this area is that we're interested in applying the principles of regenerative medicine to this problem. In other words, we're interested in repairing the molecular and cellular damage that accumulates throughout life and eventually makes us sick when there's too much of it, and thereby postponing the ill health of old age. One thing we don't work on that people constantly say that I do work on is longevity. Of course, we know very well that the better we can develop these medicines, the more effective they are, the more there will be a side effect of increasing people's lives. But that is very much a side effect of keeping them healthy, and it's always important for me to emphasize that so that people don't get the wrong end of the stick about what this is all about. How I got there? Well, I was originally trained as a computer scientist, in fact, not a biologist at all. And I went into that field because when I was quite young, when I was a teenager, it seemed to me that one of the most important problems in the world was that we have to spend so much time doing tedious stuff, like, going down mines and serving hamburgers. and that we should really have machines to do all that stuff for us so that we can spend our time enjoying ourselves and enriching each other's lives and so on. And so I wanted to work in artificial intelligence research, and I did that for several years. But I always knew that there was one other problem that humanity has that was even bigger than the problem of doing tedious stuff, namely the problem of aging. And I had never dreamt of the fact that other people wouldn't also feel that way. So I had totally assumed, I went through my first nearly 30 years of life presuming that biologists were working on that. And I'd never been a biologist. I had got into computer science, so I thought, well, I'll leave them to it, really. And obviously it's a very hard problem, but there will eventually be progress. And then while I was in my career as a computer science researcher, I met and married a senior biologist who was already a senior professor in California. And through her, I not only learned a lot of biology by accident over the dinner table, but I also ended up becoming aware that neither she nor any of the other biologists that I was meeting were actually particularly interested in aging. They didn't really appreciate that it was the world's most important problem. And they certainly didn't think that it was their problem. And eventually, after I found this absolutely horrifying, but eventually I decided, well, I'd better switch fields, really, because this is so much more important than the problem of tedium.
And it sounds crazy, But aging is potentially is gonna kill you, your friends, your family. Why do you think it is that people haven't dove into this wholeheartedly and with the full force of what they could have? There's many massive companies with massive budgets that could potentially be tackling probably the cliche is that the only thing you can't escape from is dying and taxes, isn't it? Why do you think more companies aren't, and people and individuals aren't tackling this problem?
I think really the reason is that most people are only willing to tackle problems that they think they know how to solve reasonably quickly. So if something like some specific disease comes along, then it's okay, it's reasonable to convince oneself that one might be able to do something about it. But aging just seems too big, I think. So people have just kind of tried to take bite-sized chunks out of aging and call them Alzheimer's disease or type 2 diabetes or whatever. And they've kind of convinced themselves that those things are diseases that can in principle be cured, and so lots of money and effort is thrown at them. Whereas basically aging is kind of viewed as inevitable. And this is completely misguided. It has no biological validity whatsoever, because in fact, we will not be able to cure or eliminate the diseases and disabilities of old age like Alzheimer's at all unless we acknowledge that they are part of aging. They're part and parcel of the same network of processes, and therefore the only way to tackle them is by some coherent, comprehensive panel of interventions that tackles the whole of aging, including the bits that we don't call diseases.
Okay, well, do you want to just give us, if it's possible to do so, a quick overview of what aging is, just so we've got set a baseline and the audience knows exactly what you're tackling?
Well, sure. So the other kind of misapprehension that people have is the idea that aging is some kind of mystery. Aging isn't a mystery at all. Aging of the human body or of any living organism is really just the same as aging of an inanimate machine, like a car. It's not really anything to do with biology. It's a fact of physics that any machine with moving parts is going to do damage to itself as a side effect of its normal operation throughout its existence. And the machine that we call the human body is no exception. So we do damage to ourselves as a side effect of our normal metabolic processes, even starting before we're born. Now, also, just like an inanimate machine, the human body is set up to tolerate a certain amount of damage and to function perfectly well with that certain amount. And that's why people in their 40s are typically working just as well, both physically and mentally functioning just as well as people in their 20s. But of course, people in their 40s have a considerably shorter remaining life expectancy, average time they're going to live. And that's because they've been accumulating damage that has not yet got to the point where it's bad for you. So all we really need to do is to stop that from happening, to stop that damage from reaching this level that causes the disabilities and diseases of old age. And one might say, well, there are basically two ways of doing that. We can somehow clean up the body so that it doesn't make the damage in the first place, or we can find ways to repair the damage. And it so happens that stopping the damage from happening is really, really, really hard, basically because it's so complicated and because we understand the workings of the body still very, very superficially. But repairing the damage after it's been created is a lot easier, and that's the approach that SENS Research Foundation is pursuing.
Because I guess the body's already got processes for repairing the damage anyway. So are you looking at just optimizing and boosting those processes?
Great question.
Or are you creating new processes from scratch?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in fact, we are looking at creating new processes. But you're absolutely right. The body does have fantastic automatic built-in self-repair mechanisms, far, far more sophisticated than any man-made machine has. So you may ask, don't we just need to ramp those processes up a bit? The answer is no, because the repair processes we have are each targeted at a certain category of damage, a certain type of damage, and there are just some types of damage that we don't have any processes to repair. Those are typically the types of damage that, for whatever reason, naturally only accumulate really slowly, so they just don't achieve a level of abundance that's bad for us until people are getting to be quite old, and therefore will have already reproduced. Evolution really doesn't care about individuals after they've had a chance to have offspring, because...
Well, I was going to ask about that. Is that programmed into us to die off so that there's another generation to reproduce, through natural selection and all that, that the species will survive and evolve to be better? Is that built into our genes?
Absolutely not. There are no genes for aging. No genes whose selected purpose is to cause us to age more rapidly than we would if we didn't have those genes. All it's about is gaps in what evolution has tried to do to stop us from aging. One of my colleagues a long time ago said very succinctly, he said, aging is a product of evolutionary neglect, not evolutionary intent. So basically what we've got is all of these various repair processes, but there are gaps in them. There are occasional types of damage that the body creates that are not repaired. Those are the ones that accumulate, and those are the ones that actually drive the eventual decline in mental and physical function that we see in old age.
And what are the main causes and the main problems that we have as we age? Are there any specifics, or is it just countless different things that need to be tackled?
There are lots and lots and lots, but the big insight that I was able to have that inspired the creation of SENS Research Foundation and all the research that we do was that even though there are lots and lots of them, we can classify them into a very manageable number of categories, only 7 major categories. And the purpose of this classification is that within each category there is one generic therapy which can be applied to all examples within the category, with differences only in detail as between one example and another. So, okay. For example, one of the categories is cell loss of cells. So that means simply cells dying and not being automatically replaced by the division of other cells. The generic approach to fixing that problem is something that everyone already is familiar with. It's just called stem cell therapy. We put cells in which are set up in the state where they will be able to divide and transform into the cells that the body was not replacing on its own. And so the number of cells is restored, and sure enough, the function is restored. People are already looking at using stem cell therapy for those aspects of aging that are mainly driven by cell loss, and progress is very good indeed. Probably the most conspicuous example is Parkinson's disease, which is caused by the loss of neurons, brain cells, in a particular part of the brain called the substantia nigra, and a particular type of neuron called a dopaminergic neuron. And the first attempt to use stem cell therapy for Parkinson's disease was only very patchily successful because we weren't yet very good at figuring out how to manipulate stem cells so that they would do the right thing after we put them in the body. But that's changed over the past 10 or 20 years, and now there are clinical trials going on for this, and it's all looking extremely good. I think there's at least a 50-50 chance that we will be able to call Parkinson's disease genuinely cured within as little as 10 years from now.
Wow, that sounds fascinating. I mean, with the stem cell side of things as well, how far away, and I know bits of this have been done, but and it'd be interesting to see your opinion on whether you think this is actually useful or not. But how far away do you think we are from growing things that have organs that have been damaged and just transplanting them as opposed to repairing what we've already got?
That's certainly already also moving very fast. The field of tissue engineering, which is the field you're describing, is very intimately linked with the field of stem cell research. And certainly there are already cases of organs that can be built outside the lab and transplanted. The organs for which the greatest success has occurred so far tend to be organs that don't have much of a blood supply because they're basically flat. So the bladder, for example. But big progress is being made over the past several years in developing the same kind of technology for solid organs. And there's been big advances also in getting around the difficulty of immune rejection, which of course has always been a difficulty with doing a transplant from someone who's just died, someone else. So yeah, that's great. There's great progress there. But actually, the way we should be thinking about this is that repairing the organs that we've already got is a superior alternative relative to making a whole new organ and putting it back in the body, because the process of putting a new organ back in the body is, invasive. It involves surgery. It's a dangerous process in and of itself. So if we can do the replacement at the more microscopic level, just using stem cells and so on, then we've actually got a better solution.
Cool. Well, can you run through the other 7 classifications which you mentioned a bit earlier on?
The other 6.
So there were 6.
Okay, so I mentioned cell loss. There are two categories which come under kind of the opposite of cell loss, having too many cells rather than too few. And the reason there are two such categories is because depending on how the excess of cells comes about, there are two very different ways of going about fixing the problem and getting rid of those cells. One of the ways it can happen is when cells are dividing when they're not supposed to. And that's obviously more or less the definition of cancer. Cancer is the hardest part of aging to fix, and we have an approach to addressing it which is very ambitious and elaborate. I probably don't even have time to go into it in this interview, but we think we can really, really hit cancer on the head, but it's going to be very difficult to implement. The other type of having too many cells is if cells are not dying when they are supposed to. So people don't often think about that, but it turns out that the death of cells is a very important aspect of the function of the immune system, for example. And in the immune system, if that stops happening, which it does to a certain extent in old age, then that has a big contribution to why we're not so good at fighting off infections late in life. Now, the approach to fixing that is basically to kill the cells that you've got too many of, just directly. And there are various approaches. The approach that we're interested in at the moment is suicide gene therapy, which is essentially putting genes that encode toxic proteins into cells, but putting them in such a way that they only make the protein when the cell gets into this state that we want to get rid of. This is a relatively routine technique in the laboratory, but making it work safely in humans is still quite a challenge. So we're working on that. Then the other four categories are all at the molecular level, rather than anything to do with number of cells. It's to do with what's going on inside cells in two cases, or in the other two cases, outside cells, in the spaces between. So inside cells, we've got mitochondrial mutations. The mitochondrion is this part of the cell that does the chemistry of breathing, the combining of oxygen with nutrients to extract energy from the nutrients. And it turns out that the mitochondria have their own DNA. And that DNA mutates. In fact, it mutates far, far faster than the regular genome in the nucleus of cells. So we want to fix that. There are a few approaches that have been suggested, and the approach that we're pursuing, which was first suggested about 30 years ago, is to make backup copies of the mitochondrial DNA in the nucleus, which is something that there's been a bit of success in trying to do in the lab over the years. But it's hit a few roadblocks, but we reckon we know how to get through those roadblocks, and we think we're a lot closer than we used to be. Finally, inside the cell, there is the accumulation of simple garbage, simple waste products, byproducts of normal metabolism that the cell doesn't know how to break down or to excrete. And so, of course, eventually you've got too much garbage, just like, you can have one garbage can's worth of garbage in your kitchen and nothing goes wrong, but when you've got more than that, things start to tell. So what we're doing about that problem is we're introducing new genes for new enzymes into the cell that humans don't normally have. Typically, we find these genes in bacteria, and these enzymes that are encoded simply break down the garbage. We find them by using a method called an enrichment culture, which is actually a technique stolen from environmental decontamination, where people find bacteria that can break down pollutants like TNT or dioxins or whatever. But having found the bacteria, then we find the genes that they have and so on. So it's all a pretty ambitious approach, but it seems to be going somewhere. We've already got great success in identifying and indeed using the genes that certain bacteria have for breaking down the major toxic molecule that drives atherosclerosis. So of course, atherosclerosis is the number one killer in the Western world. It causes heart attacks and strokes. Turns out that it's driven by the accumulation of a particular type of oxidized cholesterol, and we can break that down now, and we can protect human cells from this toxic molecule by giving them this gene.
It sounds absolutely fascinating, and I just want to ask one question there. In that, when you say introducing new genes, do you mean introducing new genes into human genome essentially, and creating? I can't think of any words put it other than some kind of superhuman that isn't affected by aging.
Well, we're not talking about any kind of not being affected by aging. This is just kind of augmenting what we have. So it's not really going to change anything so fundamental.
Sure.
We're going to have to carry on improving the comprehensiveness of these therapies forever, I suspect. We'll never make them 100% comprehensive. But sure, I mean, these changes will be augmentations, some of them genetic augmentations, that will definitely diminish the problem of aging very substantially.
You're creating then someone or a being that can live for longer. Will there be a point where that person then will live for long enough that the next generation of all this will come through, then will live long enough for the next generation of that to come through, and within the realm of our own consciousness and thinking into the future, do you think that there will be someone that will be able to live forever?
I think you've basically got it, yes. So about 10 years ago, I coined the phrase longevity escape velocity to describe this concept. I basically pointed out that if we, let's say in the next 25 years, develop therapies that can be applied to people who are already in middle age, so they've got lots of damage, but they're still basically healthy, and can repair most of that damage, even if it only repairs most of the damage, not all, then maybe those people will get 30 years of additional healthy life, which means they won't be biologically 60 again until they're chronologically 90, for example, okay, just for illustration. By that time, it will be harder to fix them up. We won't be able to just use the same therapies and carry on doing that, because the damage that will be accumulating will be the damage that the therapies don't yet fix. But if we can improve the comprehensiveness of the therapies fast enough, then after those 30 years, we'll be able to use, version 2.0 and actually do a better job than we did before, even though the problem is inherently more difficult. So that the third time that these people, after they've been re-rejuvenated, the third time they are biologically 60, they'll actually be chronologically 150, and so on. So it's basically just a case of how fast do we have to develop to improve the comprehensiveness of the therapies in order to stay one step ahead of the problem. And looking at that question, it's actually vanishingly unlikely, in my view, that we will fail to stay ahead after we get these first-generation therapies that we're working on now that may give 30 years of extra life. So that's why I've predicted that there are plenty of people alive today who have a good chance of living indefinitely. Of course, you can't talk about living forever because I'm only working on one cause of death, right? I'm not working on stopping people from being hit by trucks and so on. Certainly the point is that the risk of death in the coming year will be the same however long ago you were born.
Well, I think if people were living for longer and longer and longer, the risk of death from blowing each other up is going to increase and increase over that period of time as well. So that's probably going to be more likely than mitochondrial damage over time, isn't it?
Well, we shall see. I mean, one other way, an alternative way of looking at it is that when we eliminate the most prevalent cause of death that we have today, and let's remember, aging kills about 90% of people in the Western world. It's responsible for 90% of all deaths. Even if you take the world as a whole, it's responsible for about 2/3 of all deaths. So if we remove all that, and people are only dying of accidents or homicide or whatever, then the chances are that we won't really be terribly fond of that fact, and we'll try and do something about it, and spend more money in safer cars and on vaccine development to avoid pandemics and so on and so forth.
I'm glad you took a positive spin on that, because I was being a bit miserable then, wasn't I?
Well, it's not a positive spin, I mean, I think it's a very objective interpretation. It doesn't seem to me that people would be terribly happy about having any cause of death that is the number one cause of death if they think they can fix it. And of course, we don't have this this sense of fatalism about car accidents or pandemics that we have about aging. Once they become a big problem, then we're likely to attend to them.
For sure. Okay then, Aubrey, let's move on to you. And can you tell us a little bit about what you were personally doing, whether you're storing stem cells or, if there's any other interventions that you're doing that you can share with us?
I'm not actually doing anything for myself. That's not necessarily my recommendation to other people, though. I'm genetically just lucky. I just seem to be doing very well for my age. Whenever I get any kind of measures of my biological age, I always come out really young, which is very nice. And of course, what it means is that it's best for me to be conservative and to stick to the lifestyle and so on that I have always followed, which is not necessarily the same lifestyle that most people would follow. Some people would probably get overweight if they had my diet, and if you get overweight, then you should change your diet so that you don't. But that's the point. It's the outcome. The only real generalization one can make is that everyone should pay attention to their body and not do things that make you feel sick. Beyond that, storing stem cells is probably useful for for your baby if you can afford it, but not probably for aging purposes. Only for the low risk of diseases that would happen early in life. For aging, the chances are that by the time any baby has reached an age where they would be suffering any of the diseases of aging, we'll have such good therapies that essentially make the use of one's own embryonic or umbilical cord stem cells unnecessary. Yeah.
Interesting. Oh, yeah. To be honest, I don't know why, but I thought you were going to come out with all kinds of like crazy things then. But it's fascinating to me that, yeah, you're just living a healthy lifestyle whilst, doing the work and pushing the whole movement forward.
That's right. Well, I wouldn't say that my lifestyle is healthy. I definitely don't get enough sleep. But I figure I'm probably hastening the defeat of aging by a larger margin than the amount I'm shortening my own life by not getting enough sleep. So.
Well, Aubrey, can we do some quick-fire questions just to learn a little bit more about you?
Of course.
Which country do you think has the best scientists?
That's a very hard question. I would say that there's a distinction one has to make here between scientists per se, in other words, people who try to understand nature better, as opposed to technologists, people who try to manipulate nature. I'm kind of a bit of both, and I think that in order to work in any kind of pioneering technology, you have to be a bit of both. You have to be very goal-directed, knowing where you're going, but at the same time, you have to be willing to work on really hard problems for which there are fundamental areas of ignorance. So I would say that the balance between those two in different countries may be a little different. Perhaps the UK has really top-class scientists who are curiosity-driven, and they're rather bad at exploiting what they find out for technological purposes, and certainly for making money out of it. Maybe at the other end of the spectrum, one might take Japan, which is obviously known very strongly for its technological prowess, but which only has a very much lower incidence of, for example, Nobel Prize winners.
Nobel Prize winners is probably a good way of putting it. To be honest, I was hoping you were going to say the UK and we'd be like, yeah, hoorah, UK. But yeah, it wasn't as simple as that. Next question. If you could punch anyone in the face, who would it be?
That's a pretty good question. Larry Ellison.
Okay, that was a quick... I've asked that to quite a few guests now, and other people have ummed and ahed, but you're the first person to come out with a name like as easy as that.
Well, let me tell you why. Because Larry Ellison, about 15 or 16 years ago, made a momentous decision. You probably, in case you don't know who he is, he's the guy who founded Oracle Corporation, and he's one of the top 10 richest people in the world. He's been in the top 2 or 3 for certain periods. He has an awful lot of money. And he made a momentous decision in the late 90s to put a very considerable proportion of his net worth, like 20 or 30 or 40 million dollars per year, into a charitable foundation. And he directed that charitable foundation to focus on aging. So that sounds wonderful. But he then completely messed it up. But then the way he set up the foundation was pretty much guaranteed to make almost no difference to what was actually able to be possible. Essentially what he did was he set it up so that the people who would be funded by this charity would be exactly the same people that were already being funded by the government. So he might have, supplemented the amount of research that was done so that a bit more of it was done, but he certainly didn't put any money into areas that were being neglected, so as to broaden our options. And he could have made 10 times more difference if he'd done it differently. So that's why Larry Ellison is my choice. Okay,
cool. That sounds more than reasonable. If you could recommend one book to the Upgraded Ape audience, what would it be?
I guess it would have to be my book. Ending Age was published back in 2007. It described all of the areas of research that I believe need to be done in order to bring aging under medical control. It's actually still pretty up to date. And that's certainly not because there's been not much progress. There's been masses of progress. But rather, it's because the progress that has happened has been very, very strongly in line with what we thought it would be back then. In other words, this is really a great testament to the idea that the paradigm we're pursuing is standing the test of time. So it's very good news. The book is written for a general audience in the sense that it is, it doesn't rely on lots of biological jargon and so on. But at the same time, it's very thorough indeed. No one will feel that I've been cutting corners in this book. So it's not the kind of book that one will read in one sitting. It's quite hard work.
Do you want to tell the audience what it's called and where they can find it?
It's called Ending Aging, and you can find it anywhere. You can go to Amazon, you can go to wherever you like.
Awesome stuff. Well, Aubrey, I've got one final question for you, and it's something I've asked everyone who's come on the show so far. If you could go back in time and speak with your younger self, what would be one piece of advice you'd give him to help either upgrade his brain, help him get more done, or just have more impact?
That's a really hard question, because I'm honestly not sure whether I would have made more of a contribution by now to postponing aging if I had always been working on the biology of aging. You know, if someone had explained to me when I was, let's say, 16, that actually most people don't understand that aging is the world's worst problem, then I would probably have gone into that field straight away, rather than spending my time in computer science for 15 years before switching fields. And, you know, of course, I expect I would have done reasonable work, but I'm not honestly sure whether I would have made more of a contribution by now. I think maybe I've actually gained from the fact of having had two different careers and having switched fields. There's a quite distinguished history of people doing that in science and making big contributions in their new field because they're not too encumbered by conventional wisdom. So what would I have advised myself to do? I'm not really sure. I think I can proudly say that I haven't made too many mistakes in my life so far.
Good stuff, and great answer. Well, that's about time for us, Aubrey. Can you tell us a little bit more where the audience can find out about SENS and, any other links that you want to share?
Absolutely. So, of course, the book I've already mentioned, but the first place to start, if you want to know what we do and why and how we're getting on, is to go to our website, sens.org. That's SENS, so it's not SENSE, the way that you might naturally spell it. It stands for Strategies for Engineered Negligible Senescence, but luckily you don't need to know that. Just sens.org. And, of course, we have lots of information there for any kind of audience, for scientists, for the general public, for policymakers, anyone, and lots of news about what we've been doing recently, lots about what we're going to be doing in the future. And, of course, there's a nice big donate button.
Awesome stuff. Well, Aubrey, I just want to say thanks again for coming on the Upgraded Ape Show. And, I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much.